So the idea behind this example is to try to consider a situation in which we actually have perfect information about the degree of substitution. That's obviously incredibly artificial. And then to look in that situation where we really know what's going on, to ask, well, if we were doing what we actually do in reality, which is we were observing data, what would we be able to tell from the data about what's going on? And how much of a match is there between what we would observe in the data and what we actually know to be going on given the artificial structure of the problem? That's what I'm trying to do here. And this is ultimately about this question of how do we tell whether products are substitutes? This idea that one of the things we should be paying attention to is this cross-elasticity of demand. The question there is if one product changes in price, how much does another product change in quantity? That's the cross-elasticity idea. Where the instinct that you see in the DuPont case, the cellophane case, is that to the extent that we see changes in prices and then changes in corresponding quantities of another product, that we should think that means that if the price of, in my examples, Diet Coke went up and all of a sudden people were consuming more Diet Pepsi, that we should think that people are substituting out of Diet Coke into Diet Pepsi and therefore in the same market. That instinct is right. There are some wrinkles, but it turns out actually to be more complicated than that. It is this idea of product substitutes on the consumer side is at the heart of how the 2010 guidelines define markets, and that's the relevance here. Okay, so what's the setup here? Well, the setup here is to start incredibly abstract. And if you ask an economist how an individual makes decisions, the basic micro model is that people have utility functions. Products go in those. Here it's from X1 to Xn, and they maximize those subject to what they're able to do. Here that's a budget constraint, where the budget constraint is simply the price times the quantity of X1. Sum those up equal to how much money B you have to spend. And that's the most general formulation of consumer decision making, maximization of utility function subject to a constraint. I want to do a much easier version of that. And so I now have only two products, Diet Coke and Diet Pepsi. I have a very specific utility function, and I'm going to have three different types of consumers. But you can see that utility function here. So it's some sort of scalar S, which I don't think I'll do too much with, a little bit with, but not too much. The quantity of Diet Coke, that's X1. The quantity of Diet Pepsi, that's X2. And then how much they value those, where A1 and A2 are the values that the consumers attach to consuming Diet Coke or consuming Diet Pepsi. And then the budget constraint is just price times quantity for both products, plus the sum of those equal to B, where we'll just set B arbitrarily. All right, so how should we think about that? Well, I've got three different types of consumer. So consumer one is the Diet Coke lover. As we've made very clear in class, that's the only really imaginable consumer out there. In the utility function that I created, the general one, I can create the Diet Coke lover by setting A1 equal to 1 and A2 equal to 0. And that means that consumer will never buy Diet Pepsi. Consumer just doesn't value it. And so that person will only buy Diet Coke. Then we've got the other type of consumer, a second type of consumer, the Diet Pepsi lover, who will only drink Diet Pepsi, doesn't value Diet Coke, never will buy it all. And then I've got a third type of consumer. And my third type of consumer is someone who's indifferent between them. He attaches equal value in the utility function. And that means when going to a store and seeing Diet Coke and Diet Pepsi on the shelf, will buy simply the one that's the cheapest. Now note what we can say about substitution at this point. We can say that for consumer one, the Diet Coke lover, Coke and Pepsi are not substitutes. For consumer two, the Diet Pepsi lover, Coke and Pepsi are not substitutes. And for consumer three, the indifferent consumer, they're perfect substitutes. And so if you ask, well, to what extent in the market as a whole are they substitutes? It's really just a question of what the fraction of those three are. If you had 100 consumers, how many out of that 100 would be the Diet Coke lovers? How many would Diet Pepsi lovers? And how many the indifferent type? And that's what the underlying pattern of substitution would be. But of course, we're never going to know that. We really don't know how many consumers there are out there. Maybe there are more types of consumers. With A1, A2, you could set those numbers anywhere, basically, and so we could have a large number of types of consumers. So that's not what we're going to be able to do. All right, let's talk a little bit about what demand curves look like, given what I said, and I can define those. And so for my Diet Coke lover, the demand curve for Diet Coke is it's just this, I don't know, is this a parabola? I don't remember what we call these, but it's basically just given by the notion that price times quantity equals 10. And so if I set a price of 10, I can only buy 1 unit of Diet Coke, and if I set a price of 1, I'll buy 10 units of Diet Coke, and it's just price times quantity. And critically, at least for how we're going to pay attention to what's going on in the analysis, that's independent of the price of Diet Pepsi. Independent of it in the sense that the Diet Coke lover's never going to buy Diet Pepsi. And so it just doesn't matter what the price of Diet Pepsi is. In similar fashion, we've got my second consumer. We can build a demand curve for that consumer from the information we have. And it's the same shape, exactly the same demand curve as a Diet Coke lover, except now it's Diet Pepsi. And again, that's independent of the price of Diet Coke. Because again, the Diet Pepsi lover will never buy Diet Coke. Okay, but what about the indifferent consumer? Well, now it's more complicated. And it's more complicated because the price of Diet Pepsi matters. So let's ask what the demand curve is by the indifferent consumer for Diet Coke. And that turns out to matter when the price of Diet Pepsi is 2, right? So if the price of Diet Pepsi is 2, then when the price of Diet Coke is above that, price of Diet Coke is at 10, for example, guy's going to buy Pepsi. And so the quantity demanded at a price of 10 is 0. A price of 5, 0. Price of 4, 0. Because in all of those cases, the price of Diet Coke is above the price of Diet Pepsi. We'll just buy Diet Pepsi. So it's only when we get to 2 that all of a sudden we see positive demand for Diet Coke by the indifferent people. And then when the price of Diet Coke drops beneath 2, all of a sudden this person's going to stop buying Diet Pepsi, and effectively we're going to pick up the balance of the demand curve as if they were a Diet Coke lover. So you get this highly truncated demand curve where for prices of Diet Coke above the price of Diet Pepsi, no Diet Coke is consumed by the indifferent consumer. And for prices of Diet Coke below the price of Diet Pepsi, then they've got exactly the same the rest of the demand curve that the Diet Coke lover would have. And also important is that as we change the price of Diet Pepsi, now I've raised the price of Diet Pepsi from 2 to 5, then the demand curve looks different, right? Because now for the indifferent consumer, when the price of Diet Coke is 10 and 9 and 8 and 7, still buying Diet Pepsi, so that's the demand curve for Diet Coke is 0. But as soon as we get to 5, all of a sudden the indifferent person's going to flip over from Diet Pepsi to Diet Coke, and the rest of the demand curve will be just the Diet Coke curve as before that the Diet Coke lover would have. So what's critical here is that for the Diet Coke lover, her demand curve is independent of the price of Diet Pepsi. For the Diet Pepsi lover, his demand curve is independent of the price of Diet Coke. But for the indifferent person, that demand curve is a function of the price of the other product. So the price of the demand curve for Diet Coke is a function of the price of Diet Pepsi and vice versa. Okay, well, I've said what I said about substitutes before. We know where we are on substitutes given the demand curves. The Diet Coke lover, Diet Pepsi is not a substitute at all. For the Diet Pepsi lover, Diet Coke is not a substitute at all. And for my third consumer, these are perfect substitutes. But our question is, well, given that we're not going to actually see any of that, what are we going to see in the market? And what are we going to see in the market when prices change? Remember, that's That's the inquiry for the cross-elasticity of demand, and effectively the inquiry with regard to detecting whether products are substitute products. And that's what the merger guidelines want us to do. So we need to have a situation where we have some prices and then see changes in those prices, see what we're going to observe, and see what we can glean from that. And that's the path we're going down. So here's my situation. I'm going to start with a situation where I'm going to assume that I've got marginal costs for making Diet Coke and Diet Pepsi. And the marginal cost of making Diet Coke is 2, and of Diet Pepsi is 5. And I'm going to assume that these are competitively priced products. So that the price of Diet Coke is 2, and the price of Diet Pepsi is 5. Okay. Well, if that's the circumstance, what am I going to see then? Well, I need to take each of my demand curves and figure out what I'm going to see in terms of the quantities consumed. So for my Diet Coke lover, I'm going to go to the point of intersection between demand for Diet Coke and the marginal cost for Diet Coke. That's going to be at a price for Diet Coke of 2. It's going to be right here, and we'll end up with 5 units of Diet Coke consumed. Okay. In similar fashion, for the Diet Pepsi lover, we're going to take the demand curve for the Diet Pepsi lover. We're going to take the marginal cost curve. And the point of consumption there is, again, it's going to be at the intersection of those two, which means that at a price of 5, there would be 2 units of Diet Pepsi consumed by the Diet Pepsi lover. Now what's going to happen to the indifferent? Well, remember here, this is a situation where the price of Diet Coke is lower than the price of Diet Pepsi. 2 is lower than 5. So the indifferent person is not going to be consuming any Diet Pepsi. Is simply going to be consuming Diet Coke. And now what we want to do is do exactly the same thing, which is to graph the marginal cost curve, find the point of intersection between the marginal cost curve and the demand curve for the indifferent. That's also going to be 5. And that means that we're going to see a purchase of 5 units of Diet Coke by the indifferent purchaser. Which means at the end of the day, we can sort of summarize our purchases here, where we're going to have a total purchase of Diet Coke of 10 units of Diet Coke at a price of $2, assuming I've got one of each type of consumer. Obviously, a more complicated example, I have different types of consumers, but assume I've got one of each type of consumer. 10 units of Diet Coke purchased at a price of 2, and 2 units of Diet Pepsi purchased at a price of 5. Okay. We can do a social welfare calculation if you want to do that. Go back to the demand curve, plug those numbers in. Remember I had this sort of S scalar, which just is a way of jacking up values if I need to, given cost, for making the problem work. But otherwise, I'm not very interested in that. Okay. So the reality, of course, is that we don't observe utility functions directly, but we can observe behavior directly. And so what we're trying to figure out is this question of substitutes in a situation where all we can do is observe changes in prices and changes in quantities. And so I've put in place a baseline, and now I want to introduce changes. So let's assume that the price of Diet Pepsi drops from $5 to $4. Now let's assume that's driven by improved technology for making Diet Pepsi, and so the marginal cost of that is lower. And the Pepsi market's competitive. That's almost certainly contrary to fact, but let's assume that. And so the price of Diet Pepsi drops from 5 to 4. Now the question, what happens? And remember, on this cross-elasticity question, think about where we're trying to go. We want to know when we see a drop in the price of Diet Pepsi. We'll look at what happens to the consumption of Diet Pepsi. But we know what's going to happen there. Demand curves slope down. So when the price of Diet Pepsi drops, we're going to see more consumption of Diet Pepsi. The market definition question that the guidelines want us to ask is the substitution question. And so that's to say, well, when the price of Diet Pepsi drops, what happens to the quantity of Diet Coke consumed, right? Does the volume of Diet Coke consumed drop, as you might imagine, if these were substitutes? All right, well, what happens here? Well, for a Diet Coke lover, of course, a drop in the price of Diet Pepsi is completely irrelevant. That was where we were by construction. So there's no change there. For the Diet Pepsi lover, now we've gone from a price of 4 to a price from a price of 5 to a price of 4. That means that my $10 budget for soda, I can now buy 2.5 units rather than the 2 units, and so consumption of Diet Pepsi by the Diet Pepsi lover will go up as we forecast. What happens to the indifferent consumer? Well, the price of Diet Pepsi is 4, the price of Diet Coke is 2, so the price of Diet Pepsi is still above the price of Diet Coke. And so it doesn't matter. The indifferent person still walks into the store and walks in and says, look, I see the price of Diet Pepsi's gone down, but it's still above the price of Diet Coke. Not interested. And so continues to buy 5 units of Diet Coke. And so we don't see a change. And what that means is we can calculate what has happened to social welfare, and I do that here. But our critical question on cross-elasticity is the price of Diet Pepsi has gone down. What has happened to Diet Coke sales? And the answer is those Diet Coke sales haven't changed. We sold 10 units before. We continue to sell 10 units. And so the inference you might draw there is to say that, well, Diet Coke and Diet Pepsi are not in the same market. They're not substitutes for each other. Now, stop there and consider that, right? We know that there's an underlying set of demand curves out there where for 2 of the consumers, they're not substitutes at all, the Diet Coke lover, the Diet Pepsi lover. And for the 3rd type of consumer, they're perfect substitutes. And yet, if we were asked to infer that from the behavior here, that there's a class of consumers out there for whom these are perfect substitutes, you wouldn't see any of that. Because at this point, all we did is we observed a small change in the price of Diet Pepsi. And in the face of that, we didn't see any change in the quantity of Diet Coke consumed. That suggests that on the data we're seeing, that they're actually not substitutes. All right, let's try a second example to see what we might see. So let's assume that the price of Diet Coke rises from $2 to $5. And you see what I call that. I call that a unilateral cost-unrelated price increase. I think we call that market power. So the price of Diet Coke jumps all of a sudden from 2 to 5. And Diet Pepsi is still at $4, so we're in that world as well. And so now, critically, of course, the price of Diet Coke has now risen above the price of Diet Pepsi. Well, what happens? Okay. Well, my Diet Coke lover regards this as, basically the end of the world as he knows it. And reluctantly, but in observance of the law of demand, reduces his consumption of Diet Coke from 5 to 2 units. Still's not going to buy a Diet Pepsi, just doesn't like it. The Diet Pepsi lover doesn't do anything because it's no different. They were buying 2.5 units before at a price of 4 for Diet Pepsi, still not interested in Diet Coke. No change there. But the indifferent consumer, now we've seen a tipping over, right? It had been the case before that the price of Diet Coke was lower than the price of Diet Pepsi. Now the price of Diet Pepsi is lower than the price of Diet Coke. This person stops buying Diet Coke, so the quantity of Diet Coke drops, and then buys Diet Pepsi. And so the quantity of Diet Pepsi is going to jump, and indeed, on our numbers with 1 consumer of each type, is going to double from 2.5 units to 5 units of sold. Well, we can ask the cross-elasticity question again. Diet Pepsi sales jumped, doubled, when the price of Diet Coke rose from $2 to $5. So are Diet Pepsi and Diet Coke in the same market? Well, in the first version of this example, when we observed a change in the price of Diet Pepsi, we didn't see any change in the consumption of Diet Coke, and the inference we would draw there is they're not in the same market. Here is a situation where because the price of Diet Pepsi the price of Diet Coke has risen substantially and above the price of Diet Pepsi, given the underlying utility functions, which in turn give rise to the underlying demand curves. Now we see an interaction between those, and we can calculate a cross-elasticity. And based upon this cross-elasticity, it appears that Diet Coke and Diet Pepsi are in the same market. And that would suggest that for the purpose of doing the analysis for the merger guidelines, which asks that kind of question, that we should define our hypothetical monopolist as having, we would want to put Diet Coke and Diet Pepsi in the same market for trying the SNP test. If we were actually going to calculate market shares here, we'd obviously have to know how many consumers of each type we had. The bottom line on this is that, and to say it's complicated and tricky is never very interesting bottom line. But that's what I've done in the hypothetical. This is a situation where we know exactly what's going on, and so we can actually build it up from the fundamentals to see what we would observe in the data. And there will be some situations where we will see changes in prices and we won't observe any substitution. Other situations where we will observe changes in prices and we will see substitution. And that's to make what is ultimately sort of the cellophane fallacy point, but it's only a partial fallacy, I guess is what one wants to say, which is the extent to which products are substitutes or not is obviously very much a function of price. And so there can be situations where we will put products in the same market, and this is the idea behind the cellophane fallacy, where the only reason we're observing those products being in the same market is because of the exercise of monopoly power. That's to suggest that we want to be careful about that, in the sense that we may be building a market which is artificially large, given the way it's being distorted by prices which are influenced by market power. One last point here. This is a nice example where we're going to observe, day one we said output reductions were the central harm of monopoly power. Well, what we didn't say was, when people stop consuming one product, what do they consume instead? And does that to some extent mitigate the harms of market power? In this situation we see some of that. The indifferent consumer is clearly harmed by this jump in the price of Diet Coke, but harmed less than you might think from the pure observation of the reduction in Diet Coke. Right? They're harmed because they're drinking less soda. They don't care which one they drink, but they're harmed because they're drinking less soda because at a price they've moved from consuming a product with the price of 5 to consuming a product with the price of 4. But if you simply focused on the Diet Coke reduction, you would say, it's, my God, look at the devastation. When in reality, it's not quite as bad as that because those people have switched over to drinking Diet Pepsi. Okay, that's the example. A reasonably complicated example, and one that I just did, I think, in 23 minutes, which is why I didn't do it in class.